Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Tope Folarin, and I'm the director at the Institute for Policy Studies. I'm so pleased to be hosting this program to celebrate the publication of the latest book by Marita Golden. It's called The Strong Black Woman: How a Myth Endangers the Physical and Mental Health of Black Women. Also joining us is Dr. Shauna Leith, a professor of psychology at UVA. So I think I'm going to start with introductions, and then Marita will talk for a moment and read from her book, and then we'll have a conversation, and we'll field a few questions afterward if any of you have any questions. So Dr. Shauna Leith is an assistant professor at the University of Virginia in the psychology department. She uses education and psychology to understand the holistic development of Black girls and women within their families, schools, and communities. And the great Marita Golden is the author of 19 works of fiction and nonfiction, including the novels The Wide Circumference of Love and A Woman's Place, and the memoir Saving Our Sons, Raising Black Children in a Turbulent World, and Don't Play in the Sun, One Woman's Journey Through the Color Complex. She is co-founder and President Emerita of the Zora Neale Hurston Wright Foundation. It's such a pleasure for me to be introducing Marita because she's long been a mentor to me, has helped me on my own writing journey. And I'm so incredibly pleased that she has this new book out now. Before we start the conversation, just for all of you who are tuning in, I thought it would be appropriate before the conversation starts if we think a bit about the Black women who have profoundly impacted our lives. If we think about that, perhaps when the Q&A comes, we can sort of have a robust conversation about the beauty and wonderful sort of impact of Black women on society and in our own lives. So Marita, I think I'll pass the mic to you and let you talk about your book.
Okay, well, thank you, Tope. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm especially pleased to be here with Dr. Leith. She was one of the experts that I interviewed when I was writing this book, and she helped me formulate a wider sense of understanding of the strong Black woman complex. So I'm really glad to be on this program with you, Tope, and with her. So the strong Black woman complex, we all know that if we're Black women, we know what that means. We may have heard as we were growing up, our mothers say, stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about. You have to be twice as good. You may not get a man, so you have to be very strong. You can do bad all by yourself. Those are some of the that's some of the folklore that as Black women we sometimes grow up with. But the strong Black woman ideology complex, I think, is basically rooted, and Dr. Leith and I can talk more about this, in our enslavement, where we were told that we had to be, and understood that we had to be strong. We had to be physically strong, we had to be mentally strong. And we were treated like chattel. And so the idea of strength became something that was a double-edged sword, that was something that empowered us, but it was also a negative because it denied our humanity. And I like to think that we did, as a people, what many oppressed groups do. That is, we took language that's designed to oppress us, to diminish us, and we took that language and we turned it into a mythology that Black women, because so often they had to be breadwinners, they had to be leaders in their community and families, in the place sometimes of Black men, were invincible, totally resilient. You could throw anything at us and we would bounce back. That's an ideology that served us, but I think increasingly we're in a place now, for many, many reasons, where that belief system is being dismantled. I was on a program a couple of weeks ago with a doctor over at Washington Hospital Center, and she said, no, Marita, we don't need to dismantle it. We need to shatter it. And we need to shatter it because the idea that Black women are super strong, invincible, totally resilient in all situations puts us on emotional lockdown. It separates us from the normal feelings of fear, self-doubt that are part of being human. We hold in our emotions. We don't prioritize self-care because we feel that it's more important to take care of others, for our families, and also for the sake of the race. So that right now, African-American women are in the midst of an unrecognized health emergency, health crisis. 4 out of 5 Black women are overweight. We have skyrocketing rates of diabetes, obesity, stroke, and heart attack. And we know the long-term reasons, the lack of healthcare access, segregation, but we also have to acknowledge that our own belief system in our own invincibility has separated us from lifestyle practices that would actually enhance our health. And we know now that systemic racism is a factor, a stress factor in our bodies. It's not just in our lives, but it's actually in our bodies, like blood's in our bodies. And systemic racism makes it harder for us to heal from illness. So that when we don't have practices in our lives, we don't have a consciousness that says we need to relax, we need to take a time out, we need to put ourselves first sometimes, we suffer, and we suffer greatly. So I'm very proud to be enrolled with Dr. Leith in this small growing army of scholars, writers, health practitioners, health activists who are dismantling this mythology. And it's being dismantled multi-generationally. I was very pleased to go on social media and see young women, middle-aged women, older women, all saying, yes, in fact, you can be too strong. This is a book that, like two other of my books, Saving Our Sons and Don't Play in the Sun, is a communal memoir. I weave my own story of being a strong Black woman and journeying to be a new strong Black woman through the stories of other women. I talk with health experts, and I meditate on the stories that we tell ourselves and how and why it's time for a new story. So I'm going to read a couple of small excerpts from the book. This is a book that, yes, has statistics, yes, has information about health, but it's basically a book about voices, the voices of women telling stories that often are taboo, often are closeted, stories that we don't want to hear, but that it is really time for us to hear to create a new mythology, a new, better serving story. The first voice is the voice of me. I was 21 years old and my mother was dying. She lay comatose in a bed in a rehabilitation center for 6 months, wasting away before my eyes. I was a raise the Black Power fist, Afro-wearing militant activist and a B+ average student attending American University. And I'd already started wearing the mask, the strong Black woman mask. I was 21 and already I was a strong Black woman. Being a strong Black woman meant that you handled your business. You did what you had to do, no matter what. My mother was dying, but I had to continue to be a successful student. Being a strong Black woman meant that you didn't bother others unnecessarily with your pain. In the small apartment where I lived with my mother, my nights were sleepless, tear-filled meltdowns, in which in the dark I whispered, shouted, and screamed the question that I was terrified to ask in the light of day. Why would I soon be a motherless child? How would I go on? I'd rarely, if ever, seen my mother cry. Maybe she too cried in the dark. How I wish she cried in the light. Despite all that she made of her life after her arrival in Washington, D.C., as part of the great migration of African Americans from the South, there was a lot she could have cried about. As I said, one of the things that was really important for me to do in this book was to make a space where Black women could talk about trauma and healing. And I specifically wanted to make a space where Black women could talk about therapy, to destigmatize and detoxify that conversation. The stories that I was told were sacred, tender, precious. And I was so honored that women were so honest with me. This is an excerpt from a story shared with me by a woman who grew up in a family where her father was an alcoholic. There was abuse, there was emotional violence, and she became the anchor. She became the child that was the anchor child, the child that both parents depended on. And she told me her journey to autonomy and to learning how to define herself differently in terms of what strength means. This is part of her story. She talks about being responsible for so much in the family, being responsible in some ways for everything. And everything included while in college, being the family breadwinner, using her scholarship money to buy food and pay household bills. Everything included watching her parents' 36-year marriage end, but because endings are rarely neat, seeing bitterness and distance and quarrels still erupt. She says, because by then I was deeply into the superwoman, the strong Black woman syndrome. All of this was my burden to carry. But at 19, Jamie took the first many steps to lay her burden down by going to counseling for adult children of alcoholics. Quote, prayer led me to counseling. All my life I've been told not to share our business, but prayer helped me realize it was okay to seek professional counseling outside the church. She'd found faith to endure and overcome in church, but in group counseling, she could hear and see through the den and fall of her life at home. She began to put the pieces together like a puzzle. Her father told her, stand up for yourself. Don't let white people keep you down. But that warning was followed by the accusation that she talked too much and had a smart mouth. Her mother said, be a proud Black woman, be strong, I love you, but don't tell anybody our business. Tell me what you feel. But I need you, you can handle this. You're the first one I call, the one I can always depend on. Jamie was crumbling beneath the burden, but in group therapy, that was one place where she could be herself, something she was still discovering. Jamie was crumbling beneath the burden and had what she would call the first honest conversation with her parents. I told them, I can't carry you. I can't carry my anger. I can't carry my hurt. She set boundaries and put herself first. I wasn't protected as a child, but now I was ready to protect myself. I told them, I love you, Mom. I love you, Dad, but I release you. I choose me. And as I was writing the book, because I gave myself, because I'm a storyteller, permission to tell this story in a lot of ways. I mean, this is a book that goes from R. Kelly to Janie Crawford and Their Eyes Are Watching God. So it's a very rich, complicated tapestry. And one of the things I wanted to do was I gave myself the task of reimagining what our sheroes would have said to us if we had ever made a space where they could talk not only about their victories, about their courage and their bravery, but whether it could talk about their pain as well. And so I'm going to read a paragraph from my reimagining. This is a chapter called Reimagining the History of My Heart. And I reimagine women like Rosa Parks, Fannie Lou Hamer, Harriet Tubman, saying the secret things that we never got to hear them say. Fannie Lou Hamer, I was one of the wretched of the earth. I was a sharecropper, the daughter of a sharecropper. The rich Black fertile soil of Mississippi was in my bones. If I was mute and couldn't talk, my body could tell my story. My arms would tell you how, as the youngest of 19 children, I reached out to be held by a mother and father and brothers and sisters who sheltered and loved me. My hands would remember starting to pick cotton when I was 6. My feet would tell you about the feel of rags against their skin because I didn't have no shoes. My stomach would recreate the sound of being hungry all the time as a way of life, because that's the way everybody around us was living. I had polio. My womb would whisper and shed the tears I cried when I miscarried and then got sterilized without my knowledge. And after I was beaten in the county jail for working with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, to register voters, my body never healed. How could it? When I said I was sick and tired of being sick and tired, I was sick. I was tired. Thank you.
It's incredibly powerful. Thank you so much for that, Marita. I have to say, I enjoyed reading your book. I learned a lot from reading this book. And one thing struck me as I began to read the book, you mentioned at the very beginning that you started writing this during the summer of 2020. You described the summer of 2020 as the summer of pandemic and panic, which in addition to being an accurate phrase, is a kind of really poetic phrase, and one that I think kind of captures how insane that summer was. Could you tell me what about that summer inspired you to start writing this book?
Well, the actual inspiration, which started in 2019, was kind of in a medical emergency where I thought I was having a stroke. Went to the doctor, found out I wasn't having a stroke, but they also found out that I'd had 2 silent strokes sometime in the distant past. Now, this is despite the fact that having seen my parents die when I was 21 and 23, I launched a very serious regimen of health in my 20s, watching my diet, exercising, meditating, going to the therapist when I needed to, going to the doctor. But because I had the genes for stroke, the best I could do was do that. And I like to tell that story because it proves that having adopted that regimen, I could fight my genes. I could fight my genes with kind of a sort of a fighting chance. I started writing the book in March of 2020 and through the summer and the fall. And it was during the time when we were all under so much stress and so much pain. The country felt unmoored. And because I find solace in telling stories, and because I've grown to see myself through 19 books as a living, breathing, walking story that reflects everyone's story, it was quite natural that after I found this out about myself, I went on the internet and found that there's a dynamic conversation about Black women's health. So that period of lockdown gave me a powerful sense of urgency. I felt like I had to make this statement as a way to almost to breathe, almost to live in the midst of a really terrible, chaotic storm that held some promise, but it was promise that I didn't trust. And at one point I say in the book, when I'm talking about our white allies marching in the street, I applaud them, but I also say that I know that pushback is coming and it will be brutal. So that all of that was swirling in my head.
I noticed you used the phrase new strong Black woman in your kind of opening speech. Is that something that you've coined, or is that a kind of a response to what strong Black women have had to endure and sort of put up with since the founding of this country and even before?
Well, when I say new strong Black woman, I'm talking about Black women, and there are more and more of us, who prioritize self-care, who ask for help, who say yes as a form of celebration, who love their bodies. Now, our mothers and grandmothers lived in a world where attention to that very often could not be paid, even though we do have a strong tradition of healing in our community. But the last 30, 40 years have opened the society to new ways of thinking about health, new ways of thinking about mental health, and Black women have been part and parcel of that. So when I say new strong Black women, I mean Black women who are consciously weaving self-care practices into their lives. But as I say that, I honor our foremothers who used prayer as a powerful tool. And we know that prayer moves mountains, but we also know that Rosa Parks did yoga and was a Buddhist, and that we have a very big toolbox to
A lot of us don't know that. That's important. No, that's important to know, right? She had to center herself, right?
Yes.
She needed to step away from everything that was happening to ensure that she was doing okay, right?
Exactly.
The thing that struck me most about your book is that you describe something that I've noticed in myself, and not at all trying to usurp what is a very important story that focuses on women.
Sure.
But it's this idea that as Black people, and this especially applies to Black women, that we have to shape ourselves into the kinds of human beings who can withstand racism, who can withstand, in the case of Black women, misogyny, who can withstand all the stuff that accompanies kind of being in this country, which is to say that we have to shape ourselves into humans who aren't quite human. I wonder how we move beyond that. How do we move back into becoming full human beings?
Well, I'm glad you referenced that as a man, because I like to tell people that this is a book for Black women, the people who love them, and Black men, and our white allies who want to understand Black women. And I think that for me, I have three sort of tiers or three things that I talk about. I think it's important to say hello to yourself. I think that a lot of us live lives where we never say hello to ourselves. We never say hello to our inner Marita, our inner Tope. We don't spend time alone. We don't practice stillness, silence. Those are ancient, ancient practices that in the lives that we live now are pushed to the margins. And yet they are deeply, deeply powerful in terms of centering us, pushing so that we can hear our instincts, so that we can hear the voice of what we really know we need to do. I think also it's important for Black women to learn how to say yes as a way of affirming themselves, and no as a way of saving themselves from being overwhelmed and misused. And a lot of times we're in situations where, because we don't know how to say yes and no that way, none of our close friends do. But if we look outside our circle, there are women that we can emulate. And thirdly, we've got to love our bodies. The number of Black people I know who are middle class, upper class, who have great healthcare plans, who only go to the doctor when there's an emergency. Many young people think that annual checkups are for old people. Like you have to be 50 or older. But we live in a society where many of the diseases that used to be for, quote, old people, stroke, heart attack, are now showing up in young people as well. So taking care of our bodies, learning gradually, incrementally to say yes to our no. And Dr. Lee and I know we'll talk about this. This is scary for Black women to say yes to ourselves, because if we say yes to ourselves, oh my God, what does that mean? What are we going to do with that time? I've never been alone by myself. I'm so busy doing for other people, but one step at a time.
Dr. Leith, I want to bring you in here. Again, thank you so much for joining us. And I know you've done research on about how young Black women handle the stress of racism. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that in the context of Marita's work as well.
Yeah, so one, I really appreciated Marita's book and reading through it. And so when we talked previously, it was focusing on some of the work I've done with Black college women. Okay, so these are women traditionally between about 18 to 22 or so. And so for them, we really talked about how they're coming to understand strength and how they're learning to embody it themselves, right? So they're at this age where maybe they've seen their mothers or their aunts or their grandmothers. These older women take on caretaking roles. Maybe they have children. Maybe they're, again, involved in the community and they're also in the workplace. And yet these are college women, right? They're kind of figuring out, what am I going to do? Like, what do I want my established adulthood life to look like? And so literally they're thinking, what might strength look like for me? How have I seen it modeled? What ways do I actually want to also model strength in that way? And then are there certain things that I don't want to take up? So some of the women, would say like, it's kind of this, speaking of kind of folklore stories, this notion that I only saw my mother, pause or take a break when she had a breakdown, right? And so these young women saying like that, I don't want that to be my story. Or saying, oh, in college, I'm finding out more about mental health, and I'm finding out more about positive mental health and wellness and what that can look like for me. And so my own line of work, it's really talking with Black college women, one, about these stereotypes of Black women, including the strong Black woman as well as others, like the angry Black woman or the hypersexual Black woman, and then really getting them to think critically or just listen to how they think about how that relates to their own life or how it doesn't, and then what that'll mean for them in the future. And again, I love, Marita even talking about saying yes and saying no, that no can be a complete sentence. And that's something that with a lot of my students or even women in my studies, we talk about that, right? Like how we set these boundaries and what that looks like for them, and the importance of the stories they want for themselves and the stories they tell themselves about who they are. And so strength is a really core part of that.
And I think that, Shauna, it's so important for these young Black women who may be the first member of their family to go to college, who may play an outsized role in their family in terms of success, or material success, and the family sort of looking to them both with pride, but also with expectation for them to learn now how to sort this out.
And you bring up a really great point about the Superwoman scheme, or a strong Black woman scheme itself, where one of kind of the main tenets is this intense motivation to succeed despite limited resources. So when you mention like Black women who are the first in their family to go to college, there is that intense motivation to kind of, to be the first in your family and to be successful and to model that. But thinking about how that relates to this obligation to express your own emotions, or this obligation to present an image of strength, even when you're struggling, and how that can be harmful. And so, yeah, they're definitely thinking about the diversity of Black women that I talked to in the college context, in terms of socioeconomic status, or in terms of even sexuality, or in terms of nationality, right? So thinking about Black immigrant women, where maybe their cultural socialization might have been a bit different from African-American women. And really diving into the nuances of that, of kind of like, what were you socialized? How were you socialized to think about strength? And how does that relate to your daily like academic context, your social connections, your psychological well-being, and what you do for yourself? Yeah.
Dr. Leith, so somebody comes to you, a young woman who is just starting college. She says, I am strong, and I want to project strength, into the world and continue to be strong. But how do I create a kind of strength that is sustainable? How do I go about doing that? What are the keys to that?
It's so funny because as you started talking, Tope, I was like, I don't think anyone would actually like necessarily talk like that. Like that would be such an interesting interaction.
I want to be strong.
I know, I don't think. Why is that? That's so interesting. So when we talk about like sustainable wellness, right? It even goes back to Marita's point about like having preventive care, or like engaging exercise, or seeing rest as like part of your regimen, right? That rest is radical for Black people and for Black women, that we need to like own. That is a birthright, us being able to take rest for ourselves. So if I was talking to this young Black woman who comes to me and says, I want to be strong, how do I be strong? How can I be strong long term? I would tell her, one, to invest in herself, which Marita says over and over, time and again in her book, kind of towards the end of the chapters, where she's like, here's what the new strong Black woman, looks like. I will tell her to think about, what kind of boundaries do you have in your life? What kind of friendships, what kind of relationships sustain you? What matters to you? And also have this flexibility. So I have this like blog piece I wrote about me and my daughter in terms of socializing emotions with her, talking with her through her emotions. And somebody's crying in the background, but to recognize strength as vulnerability, right? That is part of it, that being able to depend on others and be in relationship with others and say, hey, I can't do this. This is too much. Or can you help me with this? That is in fact strength. Or recognizing when you have a limitation, or that you need to take a rest, or no, I can't do this right now. Maybe I can do this later. That is strength, right? So I would encourage her to reframe maybe how she's thinking about strength if she wants it to be sustainable. Okay,
let me try this again. Okay, somebody.
That's okay. You don't have to be a Black woman, right? You can just like be your Black woman.
To your office and says, I'm really stressed out. I'm sure that happens. How do you teach them to deal with that stress?
I think it's not really too much more from what I've already offered, right? So, I think I would also offer tangible resources on campus. I would say, can you go to counseling and psychological services? We have student peer support groups a lot of times on college campuses. Let's identify your sources of stress and let's see what changes that are within your capacity to be able to change, right? And let's see if there's some things, Marita talked beautifully about structural determinants of health. So when we're thinking about racism and sexism and all of these things, that kind of structurally marginalize Black folks, that are less easy for us to say, oh, I'm just going to get up and do meditation in the morning, and that's not necessarily going to significantly reduce the racism I experience in the healthcare system, for instance. But I would say, let's talk about what is within your realm of control and what you can do. And let's also identify the problems, right? So maybe if it is that racist faculty member or something like that that's stressing you out, do you have allies in your corner? Do you have other faculty or mentor who can step in for you to help then reduce that stress?
Exactly.
So just kind of, problems, strategies. What is the problem solving?
Negotiating.
Together.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Negotiating. Yeah.
Marita, when I endeavored to do what you've done, which is like write a bunch of books. I've written one, I'm working on two now. And the thing I discovered when I was writing my first book was that I was profoundly changed by the experience. I learned a lot about myself that I didn't know before. So I'm wondering, here you are, into this wonderful career. What did you learn about yourself from writing this particular book?
Well, I learned that it's an ego thing. When I went to the doctor, he told me that I had these two strokes. I had constructed this image of myself as the perfect, strong, healthy Black woman. It was an image in my head. So when he said I'd have, that just completely shattered my ego and my sense of myself. So as I was writing the book, I realized that there's some things that I still had to do, okay? For example, I am a cancer survivor, but I've never called myself a cancer survivor because the tumor was found very early. It was very small. I did not go through chemotherapy and radiology, all that. So I said, I'm not a cancer survivor, but in fact, I am a cancer survivor. And I think that embracing that helped me on my continuing journey to be vulnerable, so that what I learned about myself is that there's a lot more that I have to learn, and that it's a continuing unfolding process being healthy. At different points in your life, you're challenged by different things mentally, physically, and you have to adapt, and you have to change, and you have to grow. So it was a kind of a wake-up call for me. I thought I was all that and a bag of chips. Well, I was only all that.
I'll have the bag of chips.
Okay.
So now, after you've written this book, I'm wondering if you've adopted new habits of self-care, or if there's anything that you've added to your regimen of self-care to kind of ensure that you're doing the work that you need to do in order to show that you're healthy, that you're strong.
Well, my doctor did modify my cholesterol medicine. He put me on a little medicine when he found out that I had the strokes. And I started hiking. Once a month, I hike with a group of women of a certain age, and I love it. And so I'm continually growing, and what can I do new? But a lot of the things that I'm doing, that I started doing in my 20s, I'm still doing. It's just that I'm doing, for example, more of them.
Could we talk a little bit about the Black church? So I think the Black church is seen as an institution that, as a place of kind of solace and healing for, Black people in general, but in particular Black women. I'm wondering if you have another sort of perspective to add to that general sense of what the Black church represents to Black folk.
Well, I know Shauna, I want to hear what Shauna said, but one of the therapists that I talked to said that very often when you ask Black women where they feel safe, they will say they feel safe in church. And I understand that. But my question is this the same church that won't allow you in the pulpit? Is this the same church that marginalizes your voice? Is this the same church where Black women are literally the backbone of the church, but very, very rarely accorded recognition? Is this the same Black church where if prominent members of the church, male members of the church, engage in sexually inappropriate activities, the women or children of either gender or sex that they have been inappropriate with will be banished, but they will continue to have their place. So the Black church has both been a place of solace, but I think we have to also acknowledge its limitations. And acknowledging those limitations is only, I think, for the good.
Dr. Leith, I'd love to hear your perspective as well.
Yeah, so I dropped a book recommendation in the chat as well that specifically talks about the strong Black woman in the context of theology and religion, Christianity, and faith, right? So for folks who are really interested in this topic, highly recommend it. In my own work, it's interesting because we just published a study that talked about Black college women's religious self-definition. And within that, part of what they're saying is that the struggles of kind of defining who they were in relationship to the religious socialization they received. The majority of the women in the sample were Christian, although we also had some Muslim Black women in the sample and a couple of atheists and women who self-identified as agnostic, so belief in a higher power, but not a specific denomination. And some of the themes they talked about having to kind of negotiate these beliefs where maybe, you know, I'm actually not going to take on some of these gender roles that, as Marita was pointing out, where maybe in my church I was taught that women weren't allowed to have leadership roles, or I had to be really hyper aware of my clothing, and I wasn't necessarily taught that I could have a close relationship with God and wear whatever I wanted to. And so they were really kind of teasing back and forth with like, my church community or my religious or faith community is still important to me during this emerging adulthood period. But I've had to kind of shift away from some of the ideologies I received in church to remain in that faith community. And that also applied to sexuality in that case. Now, I wanted to just kind of say that I appreciated the back and forth that Marita did a lot of times in the book, where she was like, you know, the church, for instance, is a great example, can be a place of solace, but it can also be a place of oppression, or be a place where folks feel stigmatized. Black women might feel stigmatized in the church community, even when we're filling the pews. One of the things in that paper we talk about is the opportunity to bring these two together, though, right? So it doesn't have to be either I pray or I go to Jesus or I seek out mental health support. And that potentially one of the really, you know, great things that we see within community-based work on this topic is kind of merging the two, where within Black churches, they're like, yes, it's great to seek out a mental health therapist if you need help with that, and kind of challenging this notion that it's either or, that you can have Jesus and a therapist. And so I think that is beautiful. Anytime I see it on a sweater, on a t-shirt, someone who's actually doing this work, I'm like, yes, that's the way to go to make folks feel like they don't have to choose and they can have both.
Yeah, because I found that several women that I talked to in the book said that they literally prayed their way into therapy. I mean, even within churches that told that you know, said just pray, they prayed their way into therapy. One woman in the book talked about how after her parents divorced, her mother just became a workhorse, for lack of a better word, for the church. She gave her life completely over to the church as a way of negating the loss of the marriage, negating the loss of her husband. And this young woman looked at what her mother was doing, how she was using the church as a place to hide, that she didn't go to church for 14 years. And yet, when she talked about going into therapy, she was suffering from insomnia, depression, anxiety. She couldn't sleep. She said, quote, "I don't know what it was. I hadn't been to church in 14 years, but God or one of his angels found me. And the next day I went to therapy." So that, like you said, Shauna, there's this very fluid relationship that we have with our religious and spiritual beliefs. And we are sort of taking the best.
Could you talk about, Marita, the power of storytelling with respect to kind of, you know, coming up with a new idea of a strong Black woman? In the book, you talk about your mother and father, the stories they told you, how that helped you in terms of your kind of burgeoning sense of self. How does storytelling factor into this?
Yeah, I mean, I had a father who was my first writing teacher because he'd come in at bedtime and tell me stories about Cleopatra and Frederick Douglass, and a mother who was my first writing mentor because she told me I was going to write a book one day. So they were telling me these aspirational, powerful stories about what I could be. And a lot of times when people go into therapy, or even when they are not in therapy, but they're going through a major shift in consciousness, what they're doing is creating a new story. And I started doing mental health workshops and doing what I call therapeutic storytelling, because everything is a story. I wake up in the morning pretty much with a head full of ideas, looking forward to the day. That's a story. Some people wake up, oh my God, that's a story. Or the first word out of their mouth is an expletive. That's a one-word story. And what any form of healing, whether, as I say, it's therapy, whether it's formal or informal, it's about the story that you're telling yourself. And we're always telling ourselves a story. We're always engaged in storytelling, whether we're conscious or not. But healing means that you're consciously creating something positive, something life-giving. And that's why I felt so wonderful when I came to the book and I gave myself permission to actually do kind of a 7 or 8 page piece of literary criticism about Janie Crawford, the heroine of Their Eyes Were Watching God. Now, I've read that book many times, written about Zora countless times, but in the context of this book, I had a name for Janie, and she's a new age, strong Black woman. And I think that's why we love her so much, why she's so relevant year after year, decade after decade to so many of us. So yeah, what is the story you're telling yourself? What's the story you're writing in your head and with your life?
I see you nodding, Shauna. Any other?
No, I mean, I think that speaks to a bit of what I was saying earlier, and also this notion of Black women being able to control their own narrative. In one of our studies that we're writing up now, it's on Black women's articulations of freedom, right? And I think we're so excited about this paper, in part because some of the women I talked to, and again, these are Black college women, they said, until I did this study, I didn't realize that I never really feel free. Or they're talking about, I only feel free, for instance, when I'm by myself or when I'm with really close friends, or maybe it's family, where I'm not feeling like I'm being judged, or I don't feel like I have to do this particular performance of anything. I can just be who I am. And a part of it was them saying, I want to be able to control my narrative, who I am, how I present myself in the world, and that is not afforded to Black women in the same way as white women, for instance, or in some ways, like as Black men, if we talk about, gender privilege, for instance, or talk about sexism. And so I'm nodding because I'm like, you know what, like the stories we construct of our lives and who we are and who we become, right? And think about like Michelle Obama's Becoming and how she kind of charts us through this journey of her life. I think it's so important. And it's a position of agency, right?
Yeah.
That Black women can be agentic in their own stories.
Yeah. And and you have to say yes if you're writing a story. Writing a story is making constant judgments. Tope, you decide, well, this character is going to do this, or I'm going to delete the next 10 pages. So you're constantly deciding, constantly judging. And that's why it's so important to be able to say yes as a form of affirmation and no as a form of survival. One of the most surprising things, I think the most surprising moment for me came when I was talking to Dr. Kanika Bell, who's a therapist down in Atlanta. And she's done a lot of writing about Black women's mental health, resilience. And she did a study of 50 Black women therapists, psychologists, mental health specialists who are working with Black women. And she surveyed them about the question of, okay, happiness, joy, what do you feel about that? And for many of the women who were the clients of these therapists, and some of the therapists themselves, the conclusion was that that's for white women, that Black women simply do not have time to think about peace, joy, celebration. Didn't you just see the news last night? And that's really frightening. And so we deserve to be celebratory. We can celebrate and take care of business. There's no conflict between the two of those things.
Yeah, the thing that I find most interesting and perhaps even appealing about what you just said is that in my own life as a human being and as a storyteller, I had to move from a place of just kind of accepting the various narratives that were out there about people like me or about me, into a place of actively saying, this is the kind of story I want to construct about myself, or this is the kind of story that I want to sort of construct on the page as well, right? So, and I think for many of us, that is by no means a natural process, right? Just because all these narratives, ideas, stories, stereotypes have been foisted on us. And for generation upon generation, people have kind of tried to survive under the kind of oppressive force of these stories. And so I wonder how somebody can kind of start a personal, because it sounds like you're saying or advocating for starting a kind of personal storytelling practice, right? What does that look like? What is that?
Shauna, I'll let you take this first. I'm going to follow you.
I'll only say that one of the first things that popped up when you said that, one of the beautiful parts of the book are the stories that Marita tells about herself, that she's reflecting when she really enters the conversation and saying, I started thinking about my own health or thinking about the strong Black woman, even knowing that my parents had died young, relatively young for the average lifespan for Black folks at that time, when I had a health scare. And so the reflection that she was able to offer throughout the book about her own experiences and then relating it to other Black women, and then relating it sometimes, to statistics, or thinking about the imaginary work she did with Fannie Lou Hamer, for instance, or with Rosa Parks. So thinking about how much criticality can you apply to your own story, and who during childhood, during emerging adulthood, during when you were an adult, wherever you're at, I think is really critical. And there was another thought that I just lost, and if it comes back to me, I will say it. But I will pass it for now.
Yeah, and I think journaling, is really great. And but I really think also to get back to the idea of say hello to yourself. I can't emphasize enough how important it is for Black women to take time away from the responsibilities to save the race, to save the families. I was talking to a woman recently who works with other women around health and obesity. And she asked this group of Black women, what was their happy place? What was a place they go where they just feel happy or content? And nobody could name a place. Nobody could name any place where they felt happy. And so we've got to reclaim that. We've got to reclaim that.
I remember one of the thoughts. It was me saying how much I love Afrofuturism. It was me saying how much I love Octavia Butler, right? And the importance of imagining different possibilities, right? Within storytelling, that we have the importance of our creative capacities to imagine something different in storytelling, and just not being bound, kind of to your point, Tope, by stereotypes or by what society has told us of who we are, but instead being no, who do I want to be, and how do I create this life where I feel authentic and I feel like I'm joyfully living, even as maybe I'm recognizing that there is racism and there is sexism and there are these forces that, what is it Audre Lorde talked about, living in a perilous dragon and having to raise our children in a perilous dragon, right, in the society, but crafting love and joy and community while that context still exists. So that's what I wanted to say, the importance of Afrofuturism.
Absolutely, you're so right about that. I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think in so many ways that Octavia Butler is among the sort of patron saints of self-invention. And I think, Marita, I would put you there as well, because I every few months on social media, her journal entries kind of circulate, and she's I will be a bestseller.
Yes,
I will write a book that everyone. I love that. I love the courageousness of it. I love the audaciousness of it. I love the fearlessness of it. And she's kind of saying even though I'm coming from this, or another clip, and I think this is appropriate because this Williams sister movie is about to come out. I'm not sure if you guys have seen this clip on YouTube. It's a clip where Richard Williams, he's Venus's father.
Oh yeah.
Interviewed by somebody, and it's obvious that Richard Williams has done the work of telling Venus that she's going to be a champion, she's going to do incredible things. So when the interviewer asks her, are you going to be a champion? She's like, yes, I'm going to be a champion. And he questions her. He's like, are you sure? And then Richard kind of swoops in and he's like, yes, she said it. Didn't you hear her say it? He's like, he stands firmly. And so because he recognizes that he has kind of created this universe for her where she can do these things despite everything that's exists around her, and this guy is trying to question it. And he's like, no, you don't. I've done this work for years. You're not going to come in and try to destroy this in a few moments here. We're almost at time. If I know that Dr. Leith has been answering a lot of questions in chat, but if anybody has any other questions, please drop them in the chat, and I'd love to give Marita and Dr. Leith an opportunity to respond to those questions. Dr. Leith, I have another question for you about you work at UVA, and I wonder what you tell your Black students, your Black female students, about working, sort of studying in a school that's a predominantly white institution, and the stress that accompanies that as well.
I think, so one thing I try not to do is make the assumption that they are stressed with being at a PWI, right? So I think I come in with that assumption, but I'm I don't want to place that on them. I don't want to place that burden. They may be having the time of their lives, and they may have a totally different. But when my mentees do come to me, we're talking about it. One, I try to introduce work. So a lot of times I'm like, ooh, let's read Toni Morrison, let's do Audre Lorde, let's read Octavia Butler, like let's read Melissa Harris Perry. I talk to them about Melissa Harris Perry's, that metaphor that she used, standing straight in a crooked room. So I talk about how PWIs a lot of times are crooked rooms, where again, it's not, and not to bend yourself to fit the crooked room, but instead to stand straight up, right? And like be who you are, and find others who really embrace who you are and help support you in whatever vision you have for yourself. I talk about finding community a lot of times and finding mentors and the importance of that. And also to rest. So there's a paper coming out in Journal of Black Psych eventually that talks about Black college women's activism. And it's like a multidimensional framework. And part of that framework involves like self-care, like educating others, community care. And it's just talking about like what Black women are already doing in terms of their activism. But I mentioned this here for you now to say that like, I say self-care is a part of our activism, like taking care of ourselves and taking rest and laying down the burdens that are not ours to carry has to be a part of Black women's activism. And I think the co-founders of Black Lives Matter movement have also made that front and center, right? Like really pushing that agenda as well.
Definitely.
Marita, you spoke to so many health specialists, advocates, all kinds of really bright people about this book. I wonder if you could tell us the most important advice they gave you about the topic that you were writing about.
Well, it's interesting. When I talked with Dr. Georgia Wiley Carnegie, who's a cardiologist at Washington Hospital Center, her real concern was that Black women delay getting health care. And she said, so often they're the last ones to come in. They'll make sure that everybody in the family gets cared for, and they're the last ones to come in. And she said, I'm not going to judge them, but whenever you come in, if you come in late, I'll help you, but please come in. And I think the issue for her, the issue was really knowing your body, knowing your numbers. How much do you weigh? What is your blood pressure? And listening to your body and moving your body and getting your body in for help when it needs it, whether it's mental help or physical help. So I think that pretty much everyone I was talking to was sort of echoing some version of that. Stop delaying, because what I found is that we really are suffering from a mind-body disconnect. Black women censor the voice of their pain and their anguish. They censor it, they exorcise it because they're too busy with everybody else. They've got to save the race and then their families. And they pay an enormous price for that. Black women who look fine on the outside often are really in dangerous situation on the inside. So know your body and listen to it. And your body is not just your body's your mind too.
Final question from me for both of you. How can men support this journey? What is the role of men?
Ask a Black woman what you can do for her.
Sure. That's real. Period.
Yeah, we had some, I think Lisa just offered us some suggestions over in the chat as well.
Okay, let me check them out. Let me see.
But that is part of it, right? That I think it's so important for Black men to consider themselves part of this conversation. And that's also like speaking about, gender in a very binary way. But
of
since
course,
that was your question,
right.
Yeah, I recognize
we had this paper on colorism where some of our last conclusions, and it's Black women talking about colorism, Black girls. And I'm like, boys and men need to be brought into this conversation, because in the sample, a lot of the girls were saying it's Black boys saying these harmful colorist things to me. So I'm like, we need to not see this as just like fixing the self-esteem of Black girls. We need to also be talking with Black boys around like how you're saying harmful things and how that's not okay, and how like that colorism also affects you as well. And so I would say kind of the same thing, thinking about, are you having conversations with Black women in your lives? How are you kind of reinforcing this notion of strength? Like, are there conversations on emotion happening within those relationships? Do you have Black women friends? Like, also, do you have relationships with Black women that are not just based on like intimacy or sex in those particular ways, right? So just really, I think there's a lot, right, that can go into that conversation. But first and foremost, hopefully not forcing the Black woman in your life to be strong and to carry too much, to be shouldering some of that burden. For sure.
And ask a Black woman what you can do for her, because
man, that's it. You said
the idea that we can solve everything. Like one of the women said, you know, I felt that I had to fix my family. I was only okay if my family was okay, but because my family was always in crisis, I was always in crisis. So ask a Black woman what you can do for her, and then do it.
So Dr. Lethe, you kind of opened the door. A final question. What would you say across, if we're moving beyond a kind of binary gender framework, is there any other advice for people who exist on some other, who have a different gender identity or different?
That most of my work hasn't taken it up much, right? So I don't want to overspeak. I just wanted to acknowledge that when I was answering it, like I was speaking about like Black men or Black women as though there aren't like gender non-binary and other identities, right? I would say though that the strong Black woman schema or the superwoman schema, it is a particular like racialized and gendered script that can be applied to other other folks who have other gender identities as well. So it is this notion of strength. And so just thinking about if it's showing up in your life, you know, again, how can you also follow some of the tips that we've offered during the panel, and thinking about that individually also again within our families and within the broader community or within clinical spaces. So I wanted to acknowledge it, but I don't have that much work on it.
Cool.
Yeah, I think we're all learning how to acknowledge it. We're all learning. Yeah.
Dr. Lee, thank you so much for all of your words, your insight, your advice, your massage stuff in the chat. Thank you for all the stuff. Appreciate it. Marita, thank you so much for this book. Really appreciate the work you've done here and throughout your life. I've benefited immensely from it, and I'm sure people will benefit immensely from picking up the book. I want to say one final word on behalf of IPS. If you enjoyed today's program, please consider donating. Supporters like you make it possible for us to continue this critical work. A gift of any amount will help. You can go to the IPS website to make a donation or mail a check. Thank you again for your support. That's it for me. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Tope. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Tope, can I see the chat?
Oh, it's been running. Yeah.
Yeah, how can I see it?
You just press the chat function.
Oh, just press chat. Right, okay. That jazz music is perfect.
Shout out to Netflix.
That's great.
All right. So good to meet you, Shauna.
Yeah, so we're done, right? We're good?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So Shauna, Shauna, we'll be talking, and I'd love to get those papers, the papers that you mentioned.